All right, how's it going? My name is Andrew Ward. I am the managing editor of Cannabis and Tech Today, and you are listening to Cannabis Tech Talks. Really excited to be speaking with my guest today, Shabnam Malek. We're going to be speaking about the Cannabis Media Council's new guidelines on advertising, the updated guidelines, I should say. And we've also just really excited to be chatting with her. A lot of endeavors over the years, a lot of business mind, a lot of the legal forefront. Shabnam has been there as one of the top minds in the game for a very long time, and happy to be speaking with her today. That said, Shabnam, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing today?
Thanks so much, Andrew. I'm doing great. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, so I can do a little bit of a justice, but I feel like I did about as small as I could. Could you kind of elaborate on your contribution to the cannabis industry? What led you to the industry, and what has been your journey over the years?
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to share that with you. So I am a lawyer, and most of my work in the sector has been as a lawyer, but I've done a few other things on the side, and I'll talk about those. I was just a regular old lawyer back in 2012, 2013, and the law firm that I was working for, the founding partner really sort of read the tea leaves, and she knew that cannabis legalization, in particular adult use legalization, was on the horizon, and had already started thinking about the notion of branding and brand protection of the cannabis sector. And so when I was working there, I kind of took the helm of the cannabis trademark law practice at her firm with my then associate working at that firm. The firm's name was Cobalt, and it was based out of Berkeley, California. And we just started representing cannabis clients or companies in the cannabis sector in both California and, in some cases, Colorado-based businesses who were licensing their intellectual property into California, which was at that time very sort of forward-looking way of expanding a cannabis business. And I started doing the work there and just really fell in love with it. I'm a cannabis consumer, like, California girl. Of course, I smoke pot. And it was really fun to be able to represent clients in this sector. And once California started to legalize, this notion of brands in the cannabis sector really, really did take off. And I always like to say, I think in California, we've had brands and very legitimate and respectable brands in the cannabis sector since before legalization, before adult use. And so it didn't feel unnatural at all to start to go into the world of brand protection and brand licensing, because these concepts were the concept of the brand was already there in the state of California. So I did that work, and around the same time, I launched my own law firm serving primarily the cannabis sector with the associate I worked with at Cobalt. Her and I launched the firm Brand and Branch, and we ran that until just a couple of years ago. And that was really cool. And it was all, licensing work and branding work for the cannabis sector. And we quickly realized that the lawyers in the industry needed to convene, needed to collaborate. We needed lawyers to collaborate. And so we formed a bar association that served business lawyers that serve the cannabis sector. And now that is called the International Cannabis Bar Association. And it serves lawyers across the country, and it's global. And we have these really cool in-person legal events where business lawyers like M&A counsel and IP counsel and employment counsel, who all serve the cannabis industry, get together for 2 days, and we just geek out on all things law. We actually just had our annual conference a couple of weeks ago in Chicago at Northwestern Law School. And it's cool. It's really fun. So anyway, because I'm primarily a trademark lawyer, advertising and advertising law, advertising compliance is a natural sort of partner for a lot of IP lawyers in terms of a complementary area of law. So I brought that advertising law experience to the cannabis sector, my cannabis clients, and I started doing things like, advising on compliance with advertising laws at the state level, kind of helping clients navigate things like health claims and truth in advertising and issues like that. And eventually I became the advertising compliance counsel for a mainstream media organization, actually based out of New York. And that work sort of that work and my regular cannabis connections and work led me to the Cannabis Media Council. And I started working with them in a an advisor capacity in developing these guidelines that we're going to talk about today. But it was just a really natural extension of my legal work to do trademark work, advertising compliance work, and then get involved with an industry group like the Cannabis Media Council and trying to develop sort of industry standards for cannabis advertising broadly. And then anyway, I did a few little side things. I helped launch the Bay Area chapter of Women Grow, and I teach and I do a lot of lawyer education stuff, but it's all just in service of the cannabis sector.
It sounds like the real convergence of, someone who really just loves the law and pot and, kind of helping out the community and bringing it all together.
Yeah, I'd say so. And I will say that I think trademark law, it presents some of the most interesting legal issues when it comes up against the cannabis sector. And so, I mean, I'm really lucky. It's intellectually so satisfying to try and untangle what's going on with IP, in particular trademarks and the cannabis sector. I failed to mention that a year and a half ago, I actually joined one of my clients, and I'm the chief legal officer now of a cannabis company. Brand is 1906,
Yeah.
and very, very strong brand, very strong marketing. So it's felt very natural being at a brand owning company and doing the work I do. But now, of course, it's like all the work. The only
Well,
lawyer here.
and this is why we have experts like you on this, because you've had your hand in so many different things and being on the first hand to seeing all this stuff. And, we're definitely going to dive into CMC's guidelines, but, we're our upcoming Women in Cannabis edition. One of our articles that we are planning on doing is actually talking about IP and the ongoing issue around copycat packaging and things like that. So, there's just so many different intricacies to IP in the cannabis space right now. And, what is, I guess we'll dive into the guidelines. Obviously, that is of interest, but what is making you really pique your interest right now in the cannabis space? Like, what is an IP related, like legal topic that you think is really, the one that really has your most attention?
Well, what's had my attention for years and continues to have my attention is the lawful use doctrine, which is what prevents companies from being able to secure federal trademark rights in this country. And I think actually really plays into this idea of copycats, infringement, because cannabis companies, the lawful ones, the ones operating with a license, or even if they are in sort of a gray area trying to enter the regulated markets, what's preventing these companies from being able to participate in enforcing and controlling against copycats and the child-directed packaging is that they don't have any federal trademark rights. So ordinarily, you see an infringer, maybe in another state, you go to the district courts and you file a trademark infringement lawsuit, and all the stuff is covered. Counterfeiting is covered under this body of law, inferior goods, reputational harm, the whole bit. And that's what you do. You go to the courts, you sue, you drag the defendant in there and you make your case. But cannabis companies can't do that because they don't have federal trademark rights. And so we really need to see a change in that law. And I actually do a fair amount of advocacy work trying to, ideally change the laws, but if nothing else, change the mindset of people, lawyers, consumers, to really understand that we need some accountability in this industry. But the best way to get it is to allow cannabis companies to be able to develop federal enforceable trademark rights so that they can do the work they are meant to do as brand owners, which is all of this consumer protection work. That's what trademark law is. You enforce your rights. So, to prevent counterfeits, to prevent infringement, in particular with inferior goods or potentially dangerous goods, to protect customers. So that's what's been on my mind for years and continues to be on my mind. And then occasionally we'll see something really interesting, like a cool collaboration that kind of makes you scratch your head and wonder, how did that come about? But mostly legally speaking, this lawful use doctrine is the thing that we're like banging our heads against the wall.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of, it is amazing because like it would simplify the process if we were allowed to have these sort of federal, things in place, and just the ongoing prohibition and the ongoing unwillingness to get it going, and, for whatever the case may be. How do you feel heading into, with the next election? It seems like both presidential nominees are kind of indicating some openness to cannabis policy reform or openness to it. Do you see us us finally addressing some of those issues that have been longstanding?
I mean, obviously, I want to see cannabis descheduled altogether. I think rescheduling maybe, that's also a good path, at least in terms of criminal justice and medical access to cannabis. All those are great things. For the purposes of trademark protection and trademark rights, though, neither rescheduling really doesn't help. And to some degree, descheduling may not help. It really depends on what Congress does after some sort of statutory change, what Congress does with respect to FDA's role in rolling out cannabis products broadly to consumers on a nationwide basis. So right now, even if cannabis were lawful at a federal level, and actually there's a version of it that is lawful, right? The hemp-derived cannabinoids. So even where you have, say, a farm bill stamp of approval cannabis product, you still may not be able to develop federal trademark rights because the product itself might violate the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, because FDA still has jurisdiction over certain types of products that consumers use. And so what we need, apart from or in addition to some sort of descheduling or rescheduling, is a change in the law, or some sort of maybe a statutory change, although lawful use is not itself statutory, but we need a law under the umbrella of the intellectual property framework in this country saying, hey, listen, you either wholesale, you don't need lawfulness for the US Patent and Trademark Office to grant a trademark registration, or at least with respect to the cannabis sector, you don't need lawfulness. And that would include then some sort of regulatory compliance issue with FDA. That's what we need for these federal trademark rights. So it's kind of a tough issue to solve, because it doesn't rely entirely on somebody's desire to legalize cannabis. You have to go one step further and understand how trademark laws in this country work, how the lawful use doctrine has come about, and then how do you kind of untangle that and permit the development of these rights, basically, despite the legal status or even the regulatory compliance status of the products or the packaging.
Yeah, so it's just a really knotted, sort of convoluted like process that you have to get through to make it all ideal, and that takes a long time of fighting and years to get there. It seems like, would that be the right way to put it?
Yeah. And conversely, what you could have is you could just have lawful use issue addressed and never even legalize cannabis, right? So, and in that way, you would still get to trademark rights for the cannabis sector. And I mean, which also, it could be its own solution. We could just address that. I mean, even with the current, Schedule I situation we've got going now, we have over 2/3 of Americans have access to some form of lawful cannabis. These consumers should also benefit from the consumer protection laws of this country, a part of which are trademark laws. And so it really, I almost wish we could separate the conversation around legalization and trademark rights, and get whatever group of people in Congress who have the experience and background to address a shift in trademark laws to just focus on this. It doesn't matter the legal status of it. What matters is the consumer protection issue that so many consumers, 80% of consumers in the United States, can't rely on a brand to tell them about the quality or consistency of a product. And a product that could be intoxicating, that could be medicine for them. I mean, that's a big thing that consumers are deprived of in this sector. So,
it seems like such common sense that you would see that pass to make that happen, and here we are still. So, do you see that happening? Any sort of revision to that anytime soon, or are we still going to be waiting a little while on it?
I think we're going to wait a little while on it. I'm working on it, I'll tell you that. But I do think we're going to wait a little while on it, because much like how legalization of cannabis requires years of education and then deprogramming, right? Deprogramming the war on drugs, just like you have to deprogram people and then re-educate them. Interestingly, this trademark law issue, the lawful use issue, has the same problem. You have to first deprogram people and be like, no. First of all, this isn't statutory. Here's how it came about. And then second of all, here's all the harm that it's causing. And then third of all, here's the solution. I think the solution actually is quite hard. It's not as simple as pass a law and say there is no lawful use, because
no one simple fix.
Yeah, it is itself a complicated fix, but before we even get there, we have to first deprogram people and then educate them and then find a solution that fits the hopefully now informed, largely lawyers, and help them get there. I mean, when you start talking about um, not having or getting rid of the lawful use doctrine, people are always like, so you're telling me a cocaine dealer should have trademark rights? To which I say, like, I encourage any cocaine dealer who wants to go to the patent and trademark office and announce that they're selling cocaine in order to obtain trademark rights, by all means. But and anyway, that's sort of an absurd, like, that's not what happens. What will happen is that 2/3 of Americans are going to be able to rely on brands for the quality and consistency of a product that they're using. What's going to happen is all the cannabis companies who have trademark rights are going to step in and start doing something about copycat packaging, about stuff that's targeted to children that everybody's all worried about. But the most important players who could be doing something about it are constrained. That's what happens when you eliminate lawful use, at least for the cannabis sector.
Absolutely. And, we could dive into this forever and I would love to do more, but I know we're also here for the CMC guidelines. And, we're talking about deprogramming. I know that's a central part of the report as well with the revised guidelines. Can you kind of talk about what the latest guidelines are and, kind of how they help fill in with some of the gaps in, the current situation in the marketplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Cannabis Media Council really stands for the notion of responsible advertising in the cannabis sector and is setting out to, I'd say, really like create a platform for it and assist with cannabis companies who want to engage in advertising to do so with a set of sort of internal regulatory guidelines in mind. And the Cannabis Media Council is trying to encourage and educate mainstream advertising platforms and media platforms to offer cannabis companies an opportunity to advertise. And so it's sort of like, build it and they will come. And by the way, as we come and join these mainstream platforms that hopefully will be available to us, we're going to come with a really responsible set of rules and guidelines for how we're going to implement advertising. So we have sort of the 7 pillars, I'd say, of responsible cannabis advertising. And this all sort of feeds into what the guidelines do and what the guidelines are. But the kind of broader picture, the prevailing notion is the 7 pillars for responsible cannabis advertising. And if you don't mind, I would love to just go through them.
Let's hear them.
Great. So the first one is that the Cannabis Media Council recommends advertising by legal operators to be informative and help drive access to regulated products and businesses. And you see this, I'll sort of run commentary on each one. You see this in the way that our guidelines are written out. So we're trying to encourage cannabis companies to use advertising to drive access to regulated products, not drive access to products outside of the regulated market. And you'll see in some parts of the guidelines, for example, we have an example of an indemnity letter that a media platform could use in order to feel confident and comfortable about running cannabis advertising. And within that indemnity letter are some essentially sort of representations that the cannabis company makes. And one of them is this idea of that, like, I'm a regulated and licensed cannabis company. So this is our notion is we recommend advertising by legal operators be informative and help drive access to regulated products and businesses. The second pillar is that we recommend advertising strictly comply with all governing regulations. That's also something that's found in the guidelines themselves and in the indemnity letter. So as you may know, many states have their own unique advertising rules and regulations. Like, for example, New York might require a certain set of warnings in cannabis advertising. Washington may also require warnings, but that language would be different. So Cannabis Media Council really recommends that to the extent possible, cannabis companies are complying with all governing regulations. I think it's tricky, how do you do that if you are trying to advertise across multiple jurisdictions? And that is where maybe the advice of outside counsel can support a cannabis company's effort in strictly complying with all governing regulations.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And sorry to jump in there, but we actually have an article about that coming up in our upcoming Cannabis
oh,
and
you
Tech Today
do?
print magazine. So be on the lookout for that because, yeah, state by state guidelines, they are
Yeah.
tricky and a big conundrum and definitely a lot more hurdles in certain states than others.
Yeah, that's for sure. And there's kind of I would say some best practices arise around this, at least among some of the lawyers in the industry. For example, and actually you see a analog to this in privacy law and the way privacy lawyers sort of advise clients who have to work in an ecosystem where there's different sets of laws per state. And there's some sort of basic notions, like it to the extent if for whatever reason you cannot comply with multiple states' jurisdictions, you should always comply with the strictest.
Yeah.
Right, because that's like going to be this great threshold. So you can try and make if for some reason a regulator disagrees with some sort of advertising language that you've used, it's always a great response to say, hey, I made my best effort, and here's the even stricter set of rules that I did comply with. But obviously, the best approach always is to be in strict compliance with the rules and regulations of whatever state you're advertising in. The Cannabis Media Council third pillar is that we recommend adult use advertising be intentionally created for and shared with consumers of legal age. And this is like beyond even a pillar or an internal policy. It is the law in pretty much every state. You need to be directing your advertising and your packaging to adults. You cannot be directing your advertising and your packaging and labeling to children. So it's always a great approach to take.
Definitely.
And four, sort of along those lines, the Cannabis Media Council recommends that medical use advertising be developed with dignity and targeted to audiences who would likely qualify for the state's medical program. Same sort of notion. Five, the Cannabis Media Council recommends advertising representing the diverse cultures and experiences connected to the plant and products. And I'll tell you what, I see a lot of really responsible advertising in this way. I think actually something the cannabis industry, among the many things the companies do well, one of them is a real diverse representation in the use of models, actors, language, and I really love that about the sector. It really leans into diversity and maybe the diversity in the historical background of the sector, of who the war on drugs impacted the most. So I love it. I see a lot of really responsible and diverse advertising.
Yeah, you love
Um,
to see that because I remember just a few years ago, even, it was still a very whitewashed, like stock imagery background and, very kind of not really like actually representing the fact that the entire consuming demographic is
right,
basically every adult and, person out there is a consumer of the
right,
cannabis market.
right.
So, yeah, that's how you have to have it reflective of. Or
Yeah,
you
and in
just,
particular, you see a lot of women and older people in a lot of cannabis advertising. And I think that also reflects who the cannabis sector thinks is the consumer and is the new consumer. And those are growing sectors of consumers. And so,
yeah.
yes, by all
And
means.
and also just because I know we got the pillars that we're going in, CMC also put out the what is it, the I'm High Right Now campaign, where I think it
Yeah,
was a lot of elderly folk and stuff in there. It's a really cool
yeah.
photo. So check that out if you haven't already.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great spot actually, and it definitely highlights the diversity of the consumer and the diversity of uses, and that cannabis is for get high and sit on the couch and watch movies, but it's also for get creative. Or I think there's a couple of the like one of the scenes in that ad is the gardening, the folks
Yeah.
who are gardening, I know a lot of people consume cannabis and exercise, do yoga, go running, like it's not just one use of the product either. And that's really great to see that reflected in advertising.
Yeah, absolutely. And bring it back to the pillars, not to pull it too far away, but yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we were on five, diverse cultures and experiences, and six sort of carries on from that. The Cannabis Media Council recommends advertising to illuminate and elevate the industry through established best practices of creativity and communication. And I think this is definitely an evolving concept. And as I was saying, best practices, some of this comes from the companies. I actually think lawyers tend to weigh in and start to develop best practices for how to do something. And this happens in the absence of clear laws and regulations, right? So, like directing advertising to children is clearly unlawful in all states, right? Like that's not what you do. That's not what you want to do. Maybe in terms of creativity or imagery, there isn't a lot of rules, clear rules or guidelines. So that's where we start to develop industry best practices and can all sort of help elevate one another. I think that's what that's getting to.
Mhm.
And the last one, the seventh pillar, the Cannabis Media Council recommends advertising to be green, not literally, necessarily literally green, but to be thinking about people, profits, and the planet. And what's interesting here is you see some states actually regulating for this, right? So New York specifically regulates for green, like, I don't know, plastic packaging and recyclable packaging. It's something to really think about. I think that in this area of being green, sometimes the regulations are not helping. They require multiple layers of packaging or so much language that you end up having to have a small product in a very large package
Yeah.
simply because you need real estate to throw a bunch of language on there that maybe can't even go on a supplemental package or through a QR code. So this is a
Yeah.
challenge.
That has definitely been one of the biggest hurdles of the industry for the longest time is, you want to make it safe, you want to make it like, actually meet the standards and all that sort of stuff. But there is such a high bar to clear that at the end of the day, how much waste are you putting in for, a little bit of a product or something like that? It is a tough balance to do it.
Yeah.
That it's a kudos to brands too, because I feel like that is one, it shouldn't be that hard of a thing to tackle, but in the cannabis space, it is understandably a very tough one to tackle. And,
Yeah.
it's good to have those guidelines because it seems like that sort of stuff has just been such like an ongoing, struggle. So like with that said, how many, like, what would you say the portion of the industry is adhering to the pillars that you're laying out with the CMC?
That is a really good question. And, I only have real sort of anecdotal data, what I see in front of me, although I do see a fair amount of advertising when I do the advertising compliance work that obviously I don't do as much of now that I'm in-house. I actually think I see a lot of responsible advertising. And by the MSOs, of course, they have kind of a higher stake and they're engaging in they're much more visible and public. And so their advertising is really responsible. In particular, I see a lot of really responsible advertising by a company called Cureleaf. I'm sure everybody here knows them. But I think
Hmm.
even with the smaller companies or the companies that are only in one state, I definitely think in California, we have some really great responsible advertising. I don't tend to see a lot of advertising that's targeted to children. There was sort of this kind of shakeup around, there was some sort of collaboration in California between maybe, I want to say DC Comics and a cannabis brand, and like, ooh, does that violate the regulations? Is that too kid friendly? So there's sort of an occasional thing that comes out along those lines. But I think where I tend to see some of the stuff that is directed to children is actually in the packaging and in the products themselves. But I think cannabis advertising broadly, at least what I see in particular on mainstream media, I hear radio spots here in Colorado. It's all super responsible, always directing toward lawful, regulated, licensed
Yeah.
dispensaries and brands and products. And I've never, anytime that in my experience as a lawyer, have had to advise a client to add something to an ad, like a license number or additional warning language, there's never been a no. Everybody is always willing to comply if something is brought to their attention. This ad requires this additional piece of information for this state, full compliance. I've really never had a client that refused to comply and still wanted to run an ad.
Yeah, I feel like in the cannabis space, people know that they don't want to run the risk of challenging because the consequences are so great.
Yeah, yeah, you don't want to be penalized because of that advertising, and it sort of ruins it for everybody.
Yeah.
And we see this with the copycat packaging and some of the child-directed stuff. Like, it kind of ruins it for everybody. Now we're all like constantly having to defend ourselves when it's a little tiny minority of the market engaging in these, practices that no one really wants to see. So,
Yeah, it's the bad
um,
apple theory.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I think that the industry broadly does really well with its advertising, and there is a fair amount of compliance. So the guidelines, and so to that end, the guidelines themselves sort of serve three purposes. One is that it provides some guidance for cannabis brands when they're dealing with a prospective media partner, thinking about what they should ask. And then the second is and I think this is probably the most important part, it's making a business case for media outlets to extend advertising inventory to the cannabis sector. And a lot of that obviously is economic. And then finally, the part that involves a lot of my expertise is and the concept of the indemnification agreement. And what this is an agreement that the advertiser, I'm sorry, that the media platform would have the cannabis company advertiser sign and sign on to, that essentially says, like, hey, I'm a lawful operator. I will include a license number if required. I'm not going to direct this product to children. things like this. And we think this kind of partnership where the cannabis company is willing to say, hey, I'm going to be compliant, gives the media partner this, or should give the media partner sufficient comfort for the media partner to feel like they can run an advertisement without, you know, FTC, DEA, like you name it, whoever it is that they're concerned is going to enforce Schedule 1 laws against them, that doesn't happen, or that there might be some sort of safe harbor.
Yeah, that would be it's great to see because I feel like you said, if there is no regulations, you have to act like you're regulated to show maybe that you're worthy of those regulations, and then
Yeah,
hopefully we just
yeah.
keep using those regulations as the norm.
Right. I mean, that's exactly the idea. And the quicker I think the industry can get out ahead of these issues and self-regulate and be tip top and, you know, demonstrate to government agencies, regulators, state lawmakers, federal lawmakers that like, hey, we've got this. We know what we're doing. You know, our products aren't getting into the hands of children. We're not advertising to them. That's like the main thing everybody's scared of. You know, we're our advertising is really responsible. I think the better position we're in to eventually have a reasonable set of regulations, you know, not have agencies come in and act like they have to police our behavior because we're like, no, 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 we got it. We're good. I mean, I'm not sure that
You
I'm being
hope.
a little optimistic about it, but you never know. If they are really great about the conduct in advance of rules being imposed on us. Maybe we can hope for a reasonable set of rules. And what I'm talking about are maybe if we have someday like federal guidelines for advertising for the sector.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of indicative of how the cannabis community has been for many decades, just because it's had to be. But you self-police and you check yourself out, and then obviously the government could go a bunch of different ways, but by showing that we can self-police with these sort of guidelines and keep things in check and keep it safe, that is probably the best case scenario we can hope for.
Yeah.
So how do you see it playing out? Like, what do you see? Like, obviously, it's hard to predict anything in cannabis. Everything can kind of shift one day to the next. But like, what do you see the timeline looking like? What about the state of advertising marketing? Do we see any sizable changes anytime soon, or like you said, are we waiting a little bit?
Yeah, I actually think that we are starting to see change. Cannabis Media Council now has a new media partner, PMC Media, that is the publisher of Variety Magazine, Rolling Stone Magazine. So I think that's a big deal. We are starting to see a shift. I have, through Cannabis Media Council's work, spoken with other big mainstream media publishers about this idea of like bringing on cannabis advertising. I actually think cannabis advertising is on the probably the nearer horizon. Now, what I don't know and can't predict is how social media companies are going to behave, and so we've seen some shift there with permission, being a little bit more permissible for hemp type
Mhm.
advertising. I think that's probably where we need to see a little bit more of a sea change, is social media companies just saying to themselves, yes, we're going to change our internal policies and we're going to permit handles by and pages by cannabis companies and stop interfering with them. But for mainstream media advertising, print and radio, I definitely think we're already seeing a change, and that's coming. We are convincing media platforms that they can play a role in legalization, in the responsible growth of the cannabis sector, by offering responsible advertising on their platforms. I don't think that's that far away. Like legalization, who knows? Lawful use doctrine, who knows? But media advertising, absolutely, I think near horizon.
Nice. All right. Well, I mean, it's an incremental trudge to get to our ultimate goal, but that is a nice milestone. It'll be nice to reach real soon.
Yeah. I'll be
Yeah,
back in a couple of years and we'll see if my prediction was correct.
I
If
love it. I love it.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So, Shabnam, I actually think that's a perfect way to wrap it up. I always love to turn it over to our guest. Obviously, this subject is just like the thinnest sliver we delved into, and there's a ton more we could talk about. But we always love to turn it over to you before we wrap things up here. Is there anything else that the listeners or the readers that are going to be checking out this interview should dive into more about the subject? Where else can they look for? What else should they be on the lookout for?
Yeah, well, you can go to Cannabis Media Council's website and currently download the new guidelines for free. And that might not be the case in the future, but for right now, you can download it for free. And I definitely recommend that people watch the I'm High Right Now campaign. It's really cool talk about it. If you happen to be someone like me who shows up, is graciously invited to be on podcasts, ask the podcaster to play the advertisement. It's really cool. And I just love the idea of normalizing cannabis in that way through this kind of advertising to show consumers broadly, regulators, lawmakers, that this product is, for a lot of people, there's a huge segment of the consuming public that may benefit from or may already be benefiting from cannabis. And through the use of these kinds of this kind of advertising, really trying to normalize and cannabis and cannabis consumption. I think that's also the path to legalization. It's certainly the path to getting more media platforms to accept cannabis advertising. So anyway, I definitely direct people to the Cannabis Media Council website. There's a lot of really useful information there. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, they're always welcome to do so. You can find me on LinkedIn, Shabnam Malek.
Yeah, I was going to say, reach out to Shabnam's, tons of great information on this. I could bring you back a bunch more than just in a few years to catch up on this. I feel like we got a ton more we could talk about this, but I really appreciate you taking the time and exploring the topic. And yeah, definitely go visit the CMC's website, get those guidelines while you can, and hit her up for some more information and be on the lookout for other great info from her and the CMC in the future. Shabnam, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It was really a pleasure being here.